thank you all for coming. We were very clever arranging this talk just before the Cup, weren't we? Nothing to do with availability of the speaker. So I was very amazed to find that there had been horse racing in Queenscliffe, and it'd been a feature of Queenscliffe for over 100 years, until the 1950s. And the first horse race was 2 horses in 1854 and continued reaching its heyday in the 1880s when the Queenscliffe Racing Club was formed. Later there was a slow decline to the club's financial difficulties, but horse racing was revived in the 1940s to the early 1950s in the form of picnic race meetings. We're very lucky at the museum to have Paul Attwood join the museum, and particularly the research department. Paul was a professor of biochemistry and molecular biology at the University of Western Australia. His hobby is history, and on retirement Paul moved to Geelong and became a volunteer researcher at the Queenscliffe Historical Museum, and this is his research onto horse racing in Queenscliffe. So please give him a warm hand.
Thanks, Mary Lou. So, as Mary Lou said, I moved from my position in academia in 2021 to Geelong and was looking for something to volunteer to do. And it seemed, given my interest in history, that it would be appropriate to find a museum to volunteer at. And I'm very glad that I chose the QHM. The people here are wonderful, and I've really enjoyed interacting with people. So when I first came, Diana Sawyer, who's in charge of research, suggested that I take a project and suggested that horse racing in Queenscliffe would be a good place to start. And of course, I, coming from Perth, knew next to nothing about Queenscliffe, and certainly nothing about horse racing in Queenscliffe. So it was an interesting proposition, and I hope you enjoy what I've found. So the first question I asked myself when I started the project, being a history project, was when did it start? And I found this engraving by Samuel Colvert in our archives, and it shows the sort of pastimes that you can undertake if you come on holiday to Queenscliffe. So you can go swimming in the sea, you can walk on the beach and watch the ships, you can actually go on the sea in boats, or you can just play cricket in presumably some field somewhere in Queenscliffe. But the thing that I noticed was in the top left-hand corner here, there's a horse race going on. So it seemed to me that horse racing by 1860 was a recognised pastime in Queenscliffe. And I found an article in the Geelong Advertiser and Intelligentsia dated 16th of June 1854, and this describes what I think is probably the first reported race. I mean, I'm not saying it's the first race, but this was the first one that I could find a report of. And this was a fairly informal race between just 2 horses. One written by a Lieutenant Reid and another by a T. Greer. And it actually drew a number of spectators. So this was sort of the foundation for the later racing that would occur in Queenscliffe. And you'll see that it was noted that even some women went and looked at the races. Now, this was the first race. There was, in fact, a second race on that day that wasn't really very well described, but it just said there was another race with, this time, 5 horses. So that was the genesis, and obviously that went down quite well, because later that year, And although this is dated 1855, it's referring to the Boxing Day of 1854. There was another race meeting, and this actually drew quite a good crowd, 400 or 500 people. So this was obviously building quite well. There was an article that was published in the Geelong Advertiser in 1923, and in that article he describes the racing as occurring between the foot of Swan Hill, and I think that means Mercer Street, and Plank Road on the flat. So this is Hess Street here, Hesse Street, and this is the area, I think, where those first races occurred. Now, in the same article, Dodd gives a rather entertaining account of races that occurred in 1866. And I won't go through it, reading it all out, but he does mention that, again, that the races were held on the flat. The quality of the racing was probably not up to today's Melbourne Cup standards, a bit crude. The main attraction wasn't in fact the racing, it was the bar. And the bar was in a marquee that was where the railway station now is. And there apparently was quite a good attendance at the bar. And later in the day, this led to a fight occurring. And this mainly involved the fishermen of Queenscliffe versus outsiders from Drysdale and Swan Bay. And in fact, this, according to this article, resulted in damage to a police constable, quite severe damage in terms of broken ribs, and the fighting apparently spread up Hesse Street, and it became something of a free-for-all. And in the article, Dodd recalls an incident whereby a small man was picked up and bodily thrown over a 5-foot paling fence into a garden. And the fight, he said, gradually resolved itself into a sort of Donnybrook fair where every man hit the next man to him, irrespective of whether he was a friend or foe. And then when they got tired of that, they retired back to the bar and drank some more. And this fighting and drinking at the races was a theme that does recur. Now, this is a very entertaining article, but I have a slight query to it, because I could find no contemporary reports of these incidents. And you'd think with a policeman being injured, there would have been something in the newspapers, but I couldn't find anything. Now, that's not to say it doesn't exist. It may well exist. But I think one thing to remember is these memories are being recalled by someone in 1923, and in 1866 he was 11 years old. So it's a long time ago. Now, I'm not saying that it's not true, but I just couldn't find any contemporary evidence of it. So later in 1870, 1871, there's a report of some pony races occurring, this time on the cricket reserve. Now, as far as I could tell, the position of the cricket reserve in that era was where the fort approximately is now, because I found this article in 1884 in the Geelong Advertiser, which says that the old cricket ground was lost to military works. So I think this is where these races were held in 1870-71. The later cricket reserve was over here. This was the last report of racing that I could find until 1883. So there seems to have been some sort of hiatus. Maybe it was because the fort was built and the cricket reserve was displaced, I don't know. But 1883 seems to have been the crucial year for the formation of more formal racing in Queenscliffe. And this article in 1883 reports the formation of a newly organised Queenscliffe Racing Club. And it was decided to hold a race meeting on a piece of land owned by a Mr. Huggett, and who was apparently a well-known identity in the area at that time. And it says that the ground that the races were going to occur on was about 3 miles from the township, beautifully flat and well adapted for the purpose. So there's a report of that meeting in the Advertiser in 1883, and there's a list of people who are involved as stewards and officials. And one of these officials that I want to bring up at this point was a Mr. James Wilson Sr., who was in fact a horse trainer. And he later became the owner of a property called Frankfurt, which is now called Summer Park, which is on the outskirts of Queenscliff, as you probably know, along the Bellarine Highway. If you're interested in finding out more about James Wilson than I tell you, there's a very interesting article at this website that goes into a lot of detail about his life and activities. The race meeting at this point comprised 6 races: maiden plate, Huggett Stakes, open handicap, hack race, and 2 pony races. So again, not sort of so much thoroughbred racing, although I'm sure some of these were thoroughbred races. The total prize money offered was £60 sterling, and that equates, if you simply take inflation into account, to $7,800 in today's money. But I think maybe a more relevant calculation is that prize money relative to average income equates to $63,980. So that's quite a lot of money even today. So where was this Huggett's paddock? So thanks to Rosemary Brown, who's already done some research in this area, there are 2 properties that were owned by Huggett close to Queenscliffe. One to the east of Fellows Road in this area here, and one to the west of Fellows Road near the lake. And it's in this area that the race course, I think, was most likely to have been sited. And that also appears to be the opinion of 2 people who responded to our Facebook request for information on the siting of the racecourse. And so I think it's likely to have been in this area, and I managed to get a little bit more evidence that was the case. There was an aerial survey done in 1951 of this area. So this is the area, so south of Shell Road, west of Fellows Road, and north of Emily Street. Those of you sitting at the front may be able to see a faint outline of what looks like a track there. And if I just put that dotted line there, that follows that outline. Now, I'm not saying this is the track in 1883, but I'm saying that this piece of land is capable of having a track on it. It's flat enough. The shape of the track is perhaps not the normal shape of a horse racing track, but nonetheless, I think the fact that there was some kind of track on there indicates that this is the most likely site of that original racetrack. So that first meeting was successful, and so a second meeting in 1884 was held. Again, there were 6 races, including a 3-mile trotting race, which seems an awfully long race, but anyway. The stakes had increased. Now the total prize money was 125 sovereigns, and this is equivalent, again, if you simply take inflation into account, to about $18,000 total prize money. Again, if you think about what that means relative to average income at that time, it's equivalent to about $140,000. So prize money's gone up. They were held on Huggett's Paddock. About 1,000 people attended, and according to the newspaper report, there was a standard of behaviour that was unexpectedly sedate. And there was not even the customary fight on the course until later in the day. So, you know, things were obviously becoming more civilised. So no races after that were reported in 1885, but races were held in 1886 on the same track as the 1884 and 1883 race. About 1,000 attendees again, and it was at this meeting, I believe, that the Queenscliffe Cup was inaugurated, and that was worth 20 sovereigns. In 1886, the meeting was reported in the Geelong Advertiser, and one of the features of these races that we'll come across again and again is this business of bookmakers skipping off without paying out. So a number of minor bookmakers transacted a large business in the way of straight-out betting, but 3 of the fraternity, after losing heavily on several races, decamped from the course without paying their losses. That was a real problem, and it's not a problem just in the 1880s. It went on into the 20th century. So now I'd like to turn back to James Wilson Sr. He became perhaps Victoria's greatest horse trainer in the second part of the 19th century. He was born in Yorkshire in 1828, settled in the Hamilton district in the 1850s, and was a jockey himself. He rode the winner of the Great Western Steeplechase, and this I find a bit mind-boggling. It was a 4-mile, 40-fence steeplechase, and he won it twice, in 1859 and 1860. He established a stud at St Albans, which is near Geelong Racecourse, and this is actually a picture of the house at St Albans. And in 1882, he purchased a 1,200-acre property near Queenscliffe, and later established Frankfort, which became known as Summer Park, as a stud and training facility. This article here talks a lot about what was going on in racing in this era, and talks about the collaboration between bookmakers and the trainers. And you can imagine what the result of those collaborations might have been. Race Club was reformed according to this article in January 1887, and it was decided to hold annual races, and these would be held on the course of Mr. Wilson, who was building a track close to about 2 miles from Queenscliffe. So races were run on this course from 1887 to 1889, and crowds increased from about 1,000 in 1887 to 4,000 to 6,000 in 1889. So it's becoming quite a big operation. Prize money in 1889 was 375 sovereigns, equivalent to 54,000 with just taking into account inflation, or $418,000 relative to income. One of James Wilson's sons, William, died in 1890, and he sold at least part of that estate to a Donald Wallace. Now, Donald Wallace was also a very well-known trainer, and in fact, this is a picture of Donald Wallace. He was a member of the Legislative Chamber, and he's perhaps most famous for having owned and trained this horse, Carbine. And this was perhaps the most famous horse of this era. 43 starts, 33 wins, 9 places, so he only missed out on one occasion from being either winning or placed, and won the 1890 Melbourne Cup. So racers continued, despite the fact that he now owned the property that James Wilson originally had, he allowed racing to continue on the same track from 1891 to 1893. But then the racing club appears to have folded between 1894 and 1896. It took me a long time to try and figure out what the order of events were with respect to James Wilson and the Queenscliffe races and what his involvement were, because in this article that I've been referring to, it said that he sold Summa Park, as it became, and that was it. But then we see later reports in the newspapers that he'd offered his track again for racing. Well, it's only recently I found this obituary of James Wilson, published in 1917, which states that he did buy Frankfurt, which became Summa Park, sold it to Wallace, and then bought it back again after a few years. So there were just a few years when he didn't own it, but then took it over again. So that actually solved a lot of issues in my mind about what was going on with this. So the next question was, well, where are these tracks? And this was, again, difficult for me because I didn't know the geography of Queenscliff very well. But Gary Spry kindly gave me this map, which is dated March 1931. And on the map, you can see there are 2 tracks. But you can see that these tracks are between Shell Road here and the Bellarine Highway here. And this is Fellows Road running along here. So it's in this sort of corner defined by the Bellarine Highway, Fellows Road and Shell Road. Summa Park that exists now is up here slightly. So that's one piece of evidence where these tracks are. Then we go back to this aerial photograph from 1951, and I've just outlined where those tracks appear on the aerial photograph. And one of them was denoted the racing track and the other denoted the training track. And you can see this is the Bellarine Highway, Fellows Road and Shell Road. So that's, I think, where at least my thought was, well, these tracks belonged to Summa Park. And yesterday I went to Summa Park and saw Barry Proven at Summa Park, and he showed me this model of Summa Park that had been made by a jockey. Now, he didn't know when it was made, but what it clearly shows, and this is the Bellarine Highway running here and here, what it shows is that there are 2 tracks to the south of Bellarine Highway. Now, obviously, they're not to scale, so it's a bit difficult to know what the exact positioning is, But I would say that these two tracks here represent those two tracks you've just seen on that photograph. What's more, I was interested to hear that there was another track, and this was just a linear track, a 1 furlong track. But I couldn't see any evidence of that on those photographs. So we come back to these problems with the racers: Welshers, pickpockets, and 3 cardmen. So in 1887, the Queenscliffe Sentinel warned punters against betting with unlicensed bookmakers, and the race committee decided to allow no Welshers on the ground. Now that sounds like a pretty good policy to me. The only problem is, how do you tell who's going to pay up and who isn't? And in fact, despite this resolution in 1888, a Mr. R. Lawson was arrested for welshing at the race meeting. In 1889, the Weekly Times reported there were a number of the sharping class on the ground at the 1889 meeting, with several cases of pickpocketing reported. It was believed that one or more of these characters had relieved the purser of the paddle steam Ozone of over £80 while he was distracted. In 1893, the Queenscliffe Sentinel reported there was an inviting 3-card man, poor fellow, and his friends all going through the same old business. So these were common people at these kind of events, these 3-card men, pick a card, and he'd shuffle it, and you would think you knew where the card was, but it wasn't ever. And then at the same era, the temptation to take the extra odds offered by some metallician. Now, I'd not come across this word before, and it refers apparently to the fact that their books had metal covers and they had metallic pencils to write their bets down. But it's in the Oxford Dictionary, so this is an old term for a bookmaker. Some metallician was indulged in, taking the extra odds offered by some metallician was indulged in, and there was the usual lamentation when he was not to be found after the event. The racing club started to run into some financial problems, and in this article dated 1892, the feeling was that the club had been too generous in terms of the prize money awarded at the meetings, and it seemed that the Queenscliffe Racing Club was offering prizes more than about 3 times more than any other equivalent race meeting. So they were trying to promote their meeting, but at the same time they probably lost sight a bit of the financial consequences of that. And in fact, the club had an overdraft of £80, which doesn't sound much today, but in those days was a fair amount of money. So as a result of that, it was resolved that future meetings the stake money would be capped at £125. The meeting was held in 1893, but in 1894, a reference was made to the late racing club, so it probably didn't pull itself out of the financial problems. And no races then appear to have occurred until 1897, and then also they occurred in 1898, 1899 at the same course as described earlier in the decade, i.e. Wallace's course, Wilson's course, but now back under the ownership of, probably still owned by James Wilson Sr., but run by James Wilson Jr. Those were the heydays of racing in Queenscliff. Now we come to the decline. Now, as we entered the 20th century, things seemed to be going okay. There was a meeting held in 1900, probably on the same course as the course used in the 1890s, although it's not specifically stated. But then the following year, 1901, when you'd have expected a meeting in January, no meeting was held. And this was probably out of respect because of the death of Queen Victoria, who died on the 22nd of January 1901. And in fact, other race meetings throughout Australia were cancelled that were scheduled to be in January of 1901. In 1902, there was a meeting held, and this was successful apparently, and was held on James Wilson's course. But again, we're now into the 20th century. At the Queenscliffe race meeting, the police seized the bags from a number of Welshers and paid, as far as possible, the demands of disappointed backers. So it carries on. So now we come to almost the nadir, I suppose. There were no reports of Queenscliffe race meetings that I could find after 1902. A race meeting was in fact planned for 1922 at Wallace's course at Marcus, and they might be referring to the Suma Park track. It's hard to know. But again, although a meeting was planned, I couldn't find any report of the actual meeting, so it may not have occurred. And there were no races between 1923 and 1925 reported. The Queenscliffe Racing Club was yet again reformed in 1926, but then there were no races between 1926 that I could find and 1946. Well, you know, the stock market crash of 1929 may have played a role in that. I don't know. Obviously, racing as a whole didn't stop in Australia, but maybe it contributed. Maybe there were financial problems with the racing club. I don't know. It's not clear. And of course, in the 1939 to 1945, World War II intervened, and Queenscliffe became a hub of military activity at that time. So we come now to 1946, and there's a hint of a rejuvenation in January of 1946. There was a Gymkhana meeting held at Queenscliffe Racecourse, and you know, we're kind of presuming it's down in that area still of Shell Road, Fellows Road, Bellarine Highway. It could be back on that Huggett's paddock area. It's not clear. But there was this Gymkhana organised, and as you can see, there are a number of non-horse related things going on. But in fact, on the programme, which I haven't got the actual middle of the programme, there were a couple of races, and there was prize money for those races. So it's not really a race meeting, but it may be the sort of initial impetus to start a new race meeting. Racing proper did in fact begin in 1946, reported on the 22nd of April, and it was reported that this was the first meeting to be held in Queenscliffe for about 50 years. So that's about right, from 1902 to 1946. So in that sort of era. There were 6 races: maiden plate, handicap, ladies bracelet, which became a feature of all the race meetings in the 40s and early 50s, as we'll see. These meetings in this era were basically picnic race meetings, and we have quite a lot of photographs in the museum of these meetings, and I've just put some of them up here. These are all from the 1946 meeting. So this is the winner of the ladies bracelet that I mentioned just now. but there were other pictures of other horses winning and in the sort of mounting enclosure here. So these races lasted from 1946 to about 1952, and in fact there's more than one meeting a year held. Some years there were 2 meetings, in some years there were 3 meetings, so it wasn't just an annual picnic race meeting. There was more interest than that. These are pictures from the 1950 and 51 meetings. This would possibly be the saddling enclosure, and this is where the horses were tethered prior to being brought out to race. There were races advertised for 1954, but I couldn't find any reports of races. The last reports I could find were the 1952 races. We have this program for the 1952 races. As you can see, it's a fairly professional looking program, and there were in fact 6 races in all, and you can see that in fact these drew quite large numbers of entries. So it wasn't maybe 3 or 4 horses running in a race. It was, well, in this case 13. So pretty full-on racing. So at the end of all this, and we've seen the decline in racing in Queenscliffe through this era, I asked myself, well, why? Why is, we went from a heyday in the 1880s, 1890s to nothing now, basically. So why did this happen? And I tried to think of some factors. Well, obviously, there's increasing, from the 50s onwards, increasing television ownership, and what's more, horse racing was being broadcast from metropolitan races. And the first Melbourne Cup was broadcast in 1960. So that's a possible factor, that you could actually watch horse racing on TV. You didn't have to go to a course. Perhaps I suspect a more important factor was the introduction of the Totalizer Agency Board in 1961, and this legalized off-track betting in the TAB, what we call the TAB these days. So you didn't have to go to a racetrack to bet legally, at least, on horses. Obviously, there's a lot of horse stud and training track land being lost to housing development and to some extent perhaps vineyard development. These days, animal welfare concerns are a factor in terms of the popularity of horse racing. And of course, there is the availability of numerous other forms of entertainment these days. Now, the decline in horse racing was not confined to Queenscliffe, and in 1890 there were racing clubs at Port Arlington, Birregurra, Drysdale, Mauriac, and Inverleigh, and none of which exist now. In 1890 there were at least 120 racing clubs outside of Melbourne. By 2021 there are only 66 left. So it's not just Queenscliffe that this has happened at, it's happened throughout regional Victoria. So on my last slide, I'd just like to acknowledge a few people, because this is not all my work. I'd like to thank Diana for encouraging me to undertake this research. I'd like to thank Bill and Rosemary Brown, because they had done a fair bit of work on this earlier. I'd like to thank Gary Spry for providing that map which showed the position of the tracks in 1931. I'd like to thank all those residents and of the area, members of QHM, who responded to the Facebook call for information about the positioning of the tracks in Queenscliffe. And I'd like to thank Barry Provan of Suma Park for letting me see and photograph that model of Suma Park. And thank you for your attention.